All right. My name is Cody Lonning. I want to welcome you to this month's Ruby briefing. I am one of the co-founders of Ruby and our research director, and I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Daniel Laurison. He's the Associate Professor of Sociology at Swarthmore College and the director of Swarthmore's Healthy, Equitable, and Responsive Democracy Initiative and its Politics and Equal Participation Lab. He studies U.S. politics, inequalities in political participation, and social class mobility and reproduction. In all his work, he is interested in how social class inequalities, in combination with racial hierarchies and other forms of inequality, are produced and maintained, as well as how they can be transformed. He has authored or co-authored 3 books, Producing Politics, Inside the Exclusive Campaign World Where the Privileged Few Shape Politics for All of Us, The Class Ceiling, a clever title, as you may notice, Why It Pays to Be Privileged, and Social Class in the 21st Century. He has also published articles in leading journals such as American Sociological Review, American Behavioral Scientist, and Social Forces. Daniel is a 2021 Carnegie Fellow and the former editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Sociology. Disappointingly, he does not have a British accent. He received his PhD from UC Berkeley in 2013 and held a postdoctoral research position at the London School of Economics before starting at Swarthmore College in 2016. Prior to and during his academic career, he has also worked in queer, trans, and feminist organizing. Welcome, Daniel. The
Hey,
floor is yours.
all right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to set up screen share in a minute so I can show you my slides, but I just wanted to thank Cody and all the folks at Ruby for inviting me, and I'm really happy to get to talk to all of you. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. Uh, I've organized this talk not specifically around rural-urban issues, but just around social class. That's the sort of primary lens through which I do most of the work that I do. But I'm really happy to talk in the discussion about, the participants we had from different parts of the state and how that worked. So let me share my screen. Always takes a second. There we go. And then, oops, slideshow. All right, hopefully that works and everybody can see what they need to see. So that's the title of this talk. It comes from a report that I published about a month ago with the same title, The Political Disconnect, Working Class and Low-Income People on What Politics Means to Them and How They Might Be Mobilized. And we took the title of that report from actually one of the first people we interviewed for this research. She wanted to use the pseudonym Lala. We talked to her both in 2018 and in 2024. In 2024, she was 32, disabled, single mom living in West Philadelphia. And in 2018, when we spoke with her, she'd been working at a donut shop. And towards the end of the interviewer said, I keep asking you about politics. When I say that word, what do you think of? And she said she thinks of people in power that have money and that are above us and that don't really fully understand struggles like being in debt, having a child, being on welfare. I think that's what it's like, a disconnection. And that really encapsulated so much of what we heard from so many respondents, that there was just this profound disconnect between their daily lives and how they understood and saw what politics was about, what voting was about, what elections were about, et cetera. And so we took the title of Political Disconnect because it captures, I think, the gap between what politics in a democracy ought to be and how it's actually experienced by the people we spoke with. So backing up for a second, this is probably not new news to most of you, but the fundamental thing that a democracy is supposed to do is include everyone, give everyone who's a citizen the chance to have a voice to participate. However, in most of our recent elections, more people have stayed home, more eligible people have stayed home than have voted for either major candidate. So this graph shows you 2024. about 36% of people who are eligible to vote stayed home. And that's fairly common. In fact, the only election in the last century or so where more people voted for the winner than stayed home was the 2020 election. And that was only by, a tenth of a percentage point or something. So there's a disconnect between people and democracy. That disconnect is much stronger among lower income people. So this chart just shows the family income of people who voted and people who didn't vote in 2024. And what you can see is that voters are far more likely to be in that highest income category in families making over $100,000 a year. And non-voters, people who didn't vote in 2024, are far more likely to be in that lowest income category, making under about $30,000 a year. And I always say when I teach, you can't think well about social class in the US without thinking about race as well, and vice versa. And so this shows the same statistics just for race instead of class. And you can see voters are disproportionately white as well as being disproportionately high income. And then on this slide, what I'm doing, and I promise this is actually the last or the second to last slide with a lot of numbers and charts for you to think about. But this slide shows something really important, I think, which is that in all three racial groups where we had enough numbers to show on the slide, Black, white, and Hispanic or Latino, the lowest income people voted at lower rates in 2024 than they did in 2020. Whereas in all three racial groups where we had, again, enough data, the highest income people or the people in the highest income families were turning out at greater rates in 2024 than in 2020. So there's both a race gap and a class gap in voting, and lower income people have been sitting out more and more over the last few elections. And I think that's really worrisome because it means that our democracy is very skewed towards people with the most privilege. So to understand why we see lower rates of voting among low income and working class people, I worked with a team of researchers to do interviews with 232 people total across the state of Pennsylvania. Not about, exactly 144 of those we categorized as either non-voters or irregular voters. They either told us they didn't vote or we looked at their voter records and could see they didn't vote. Or they voted, one out of every two or three or four national elections. So this report and this presentation is based primarily on our conversations with those 144 people. Everyone that we interviewed, we offered $20 as a thank you. And we worked over the course, and the flyer you see is one of the many, many flyers we use to recruit people to come and talk with us. And we had 44 researchers, including myself, who were part of the project over, I think, 6 summers and 4 semesters of doing interviews, coding interviews, analyzing data, and so on. And the researchers were in all major racial groups and majority themselves from low income or working class backgrounds or the first in their family to go to college. Side note, I teach social class. I could have a very long conversation about exactly how to define class categories. For this project, if someone was in a household making less than $45,000 a year, didn't have a college degree, or worked in the type of job where you don't typically need a college degree, we included them in the study. That said, the plurality of people we spoke with were in households making very, very little money, making less than $15,000 a year. So we have a lot of representation from people who are really, really struggling. So the first aspect of the political disconnect, the first thing we heard from people across race, across age, across a region of the state was a sense that politics is something that's just not done by people like us. It's not for everyday people. So Jaden, who was a 20-year-old Black retail manager, told us, just in general, I feel like politics is not for me. Their politicians are not for me. And Joe, who is a white security supervisor, told us when he thinks about someone who's more involved in politics than he is, he just imagines someone who wears a suit all the time. He said, a very clean-cut looking person, I'd imagine. He said, I wouldn't imagine an average, everyday sort of person being very involved. And that's the kind of thing we heard over and over in terms of class, in terms of gender, sometimes as well in terms of race, that politics is something for privileged people. So just a couple more examples of that. Carlina told us who she thinks of when she thinks of people who are really involved in politics is like big business people, people that are in good, high-paying jobs, union workers, doctors and lawyers, people of that nature. Now, another side note, often we think of union workers as, working class, and that's, been historically true. And again, it depends on your definition of working class. And she's right that people who are in unions are more likely to vote than other folks. But what we've also seen over time is that a lot of unions are actually representing professional people now, nurses, teachers, etc. So, again, we could talk more about unions if you like, but the overall sense that Carlina had was people who were more privileged than she was were the kinds of people who participated. And I always have slightly too many quotes on this because we heard it so often though. Mark said he pictures suit and tie folks who go to different political functions. Koa said he pictures a snobby person in a fancy suit or dress or whatever. And then he went on, and this gets to the next point, people who are not there to hear your opinions, they're not going to sit and give you the time of day. They're just going to keep pushing their ideas on. That's what I picture. Um, and so another piece of the political disconnect is what people thought of politicians and whether politicians understood them or their issues or cared about them. So Luna told us politicians specifically, she thinks a majority of them are from backgrounds that, they had a silver spoon in their mouth. Their parents already had plans for them. They had accounts for them, money for them. And that's another thing we heard fairly often. And it's empirically true. Research backs it up. The vast majority of people who run for office are people who have law degrees, people from wealthy families, people who've had professional jobs before they enter politics. Um, so Adriana said, again, talking about how she thinks about politicians and people who work in politics, she said, I don't think there's interest in the conditions we live in how we receive medical care. And I'm not saying this just because I'm an immigrant, I'm saying it in general. And that's another theme we heard over and over that the low income and working class people we talked to felt like politicians were not interested in their lives and didn't care about them. The next major theme that I want to talk about is the sense that people had that voting in elections were not going to make a difference in their lives. So this is Lala, who we met earlier, talking to us in December 2024 on why she didn't vote. And she basically felt she couldn't bring herself to vote for either candidate. She knew that Donald Trump was likely to cut the benefits that she was on, and she was worried about that. But she just felt like she couldn't bring herself to cast a ballot for somebody who she didn't believe was going to make a real change and didn't really seem to understand her. So she said, I look around, there's still violence, there's still drugs, there's still people doing illegal stuff. Nobody has made sure that everybody is safe in all of these communities. We always have issues in certain areas. And it seems like whoever's running that tries to pander to the Black community, but I don't see anything changed in the Black community. In that sense, I don't see anything changed or anything changing is again something we heard over and over again. So John told us voting in a sense feels like a privilege, and that's pretty weird because people are like, it's your duty to vote. But it's like a lot of times things don't change even if you do vote. And Sonia said, no matter what, you're going to have rich people, middle class people, low income people. The rich people are always going to be rich. Poor people are always going to be poor. They're always going to have money. We're not. So she didn't see how going out and casting a ballot was going to make a difference in that, overall class inequality that she was experiencing. Um, Another related thing we heard from some people, not quite as many as the previous ones, was that the parties both seem the same to them. And that can be, I'm assuming most people who come to these regularly are pretty politically engaged, and that could be hard to wrap your head around if you're someone who really pays a lot of attention to politics or really has a strong feeling for one party or the other. But for a lot of the folks we talked to, the distance between themselves and the world of politics was such that they didn't see a big difference. It seemed to many of them, as Sergio said, regardless of Democrat or Republican, it's all the same group of people who are making the decision. Or as Thomas said, I'm done with the Democrats and I'm done with the Republicans. The political party is all the same no matter what, and the government is going to elect who they want. The president is only a puppet for people behind the scene, for people, the people behind the scenes. And that's not lots of people said things that aren't my analysis of exactly how the world works. But I think, especially in the last few weeks with the revelations about some of all the people in the Epstein files and so on, you could really understand why people feel like the rich are just all working together behind the scenes. Um, another thing we heard from a number of people is that they don't feel heard, right? So Lamar said it'd be much easier to get a cat to take a bath than to get them to listen to me. By them, he meant politicians or political elites. And Sylvia said politicians have a very predictable script at this point, and I'm kind of done hearing it. So across all of these people, I hope you get the sense that they're not ignorant and they're not apathetic. They might not see politics the same way that I do, but they could really look around and say, not very much has changed. They could look around and say, there's not people coming to me and listening to me, and being interested in my concerns. And I at least think that the way to resolve that kind of issue is not to uh, be mad at people who feel unheard, unlistened to, unsupported, etc., by politics, but instead to think about what they're missing that could make a difference for them. Um, so our three recommendations are here, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them before I open it up for questions. The first one is just is connecting politics to problems and solutions. The second is recruiting political practitioners from low income and working class backgrounds. And the third is increasing the frequency, quality, and duration of contact with low income and working class communities. That last one's a mouthful, but it was the best way I could think of to say what I think needs to happen. You might notice that something that's not here is make it easier to vote. And that's not because I don't think making it easier to vote is important or worthwhile. I do. But when we asked people about how easy it was for them to vote, 58% of people we talked to who were not regular voters told us it would be very easy for them to vote. And only about 12 or so of the 144 people that we spoke with told us that the reason they had ever not voted was because of not having enough time or some other barrier to voting. So again, I'm in favor of making it easier, but doing that by itself isn't going to move a lot of the people we talk to. So let me take you through each of these and what I think will. The first is connecting problems to solutions. So we do a lot of our policy in this country in ways that make it really hard for people to see how a person that they voted for might have voted for a bill that might have directly affected their lives, especially in positive ways. So one example I like to give is my partner works at a community foundation in Chester, which is one of the poorest, or in Delaware County, but especially serving the city of Chester, which is one of the poorest cities in the state. Um, she runs a program, or her institution runs a program that funds doulas to go with low-income women to their births and to look after them afterwards. That program was funded by one of the bills that was passed under Biden, but no one involved in that program has any idea that that's where that money comes from because it was passed in a bill. It goes to a state block grant. It goes to a larger statewide nonprofit. Then it goes to my partner's organization. That program is making a real difference in people's lives, but it's really hard for anyone to know that. And you could think of, I'm sure many of you could think of similar examples. There's also, the fact that we do so much of our redistribution, such as it is, through the tax code, where it's hard to see again what's happening or how it connects to politics. So people said if they understood, if they could see really how politics was going to make a difference in their lives, they would be much more interested in getting involved. Uh, Amir said, if people that you vote for go and do what they're elected to do, and I see some changes in unemployment, homelessness, see some not drastic changes, but at least a start, maybe I'll reconsider voting. There's a term, they say, practice what you preach. That's what I want to see. And Aria said it much more simply. If I knew how it would affect my life, I would probably be more engaged. So that's number one, connect problems to solutions. Um, the next is having more political practitioners from low income and working class backgrounds. So this is Max, who's a security guard. He said, if I was to vote, it would have to be for a candidate that felt like I did, and I'd seen through their actions that they're making change. I would have to personally feel them. you've got to have somebody that's really been through something to tell some people about something. He went on, that's what's wrong with politics. You have all these rich people running for office. If you had a person that come in here that's broke, ain't got nothing, you know what I mean? And they just come in there and they just want to make a change and they're not caring about the money. They want to buck the lobbyists. And yeah, I would be for that person. Um, so Max is, again, really clear that he would like somebody that he felt like knows something about his experiences, his life, that comes from a background more similar to his. And I think that that was another thing we heard from a number of people, as well as the inverse that people really saw that politicians are mostly from well-off backgrounds, mostly really privileged. It's tricky to get people to run for office. This may be something you all have some experience with, but it's not so hard to get people who to work in political organizations who are from working class backgrounds to serve as intermediaries between regular people and politicians. And so that's one place I think this kind of recommendation could be implemented more directly. And finally, increasing the frequency, quality, and duration of contact with low income and working class communities. This chart, my very last little bit of numbers, shows you the percentage of people in each of the same 5 income groups who reported having been contacted by a campaign or party in the 2024 election. And the orange is people who said they'd been contacted, the pink is not contacted, and that gradient, that hill there, shows you that the lowest income people were the least likely to have been contacted, the highest income people were the most likely to have been contacted. And that's not because campaigns sit down and, estimate people's incomes and decide whose door to go knock on or whose phone to ring or text. That's because the way most campaigns and even a lot of civic organizations interested in increasing turnout target their contacts is by looking for people who are in the middle of the estimated voter propensity score. And they generally tend to believe it's not worth talking to the people who have very low voter propensity scores, who've never voted, who aren't even registered. And those people are disproportionately low income and working class. And so they don't get contacted, and then they're less likely to vote because they don't get contacted, and then they don't get asked their opinion in opinion polls or their voice heard in elections, and then you get this vicious cycle. Um, and a lot of people just wanted to have some sense that politicians were and their representatives were interested in them, were listening to them. Marisol, for example, said, "What would it take for me to get more involved? If I thought I was going to get heard, I might get involved." I think, both one-off door knocks can make a difference for people who've never had that. But then a lot of people wanted a sense of trust, a sense of connection, wanted longer and deeper engagements from if they were going to feel like it was worth their time to be involved in electoral politics again. So those are our 3 recommendations. I'm happy to talk more about any of them or anything any of you have questions about. But I just want to end on these paragraphs that are the last lines of the report. People will vote if they believe that politics can meaningfully improve their lives, if they see themselves reflected in politics, campaigns, candidates, and government, and if they feel genuinely listened to and cared about by those who have or seek political power. Lower rates of voting among working class and low-income people are neither natural nor immutable. It's possible to have a democracy that includes everyone. I worked on this report and with this team because I hope it will inspire everyone who cares about democracy to work to repair the political disconnect, to bridge the gap between the world of electoral politics and the lives of low-income and working class people. So I'm really happy to take questions now. And if you want to talk with me more, hear more about this, that's a link to the report, a link to my website, and probably too small for you to read and certainly too much for you to read quickly, but some of the research that we draw on besides our own interviews for some of the recommendations and places you could learn more. So I will stop there and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, for folks interested in asking questions, I see we already have a few hands up. That's great. I'll come to you in a second. Questions can go in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you in turn. I'd like to have a robust conversation here. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. It certainly reflects a lot of the research we've been doing here at Ruby as well. A lot of the same echoes
Yeah.
in a lot of those quotes. And I certainly was raised that to be skeptical of people in suits, unless it was at church. That was kind of in my childhood, that was the distinction there. So really appreciate that. Um, Jenna had a quick question in the chat. Did you divide these people up by registered and unregistered at all?
So we didn't ask them for their registration status in all of the interviews. What we did is after the interviews, in order to have a sense, to sort of triangulate and know for sure who were likely to be, who were people who said they voted and actually did, and who were people who said they didn't vote. We tried to match them based on the information we had to the Pennsylvania state voting file. So we only included them as non-voters or irregular voters if either we couldn't match them and they said they didn't vote, or if we could match them, which meant they were registered, and they had a spotty voting record or hadn't voted at all. So I haven't looked at registered versus not because we didn't collect that information systematically. But I can say the people in this pool are almost certainly really non-voters. It's possible there was a John Smith we interviewed who there were four John Smiths in his county and we didn't get his birth date and street address, so we couldn't match him. And maybe he was lying and said he was really a voter, but or said he didn't vote but really did. But generally speaking, you know, we were pretty confident.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Just one last thing before we go to people, folks who have their hands
Hmm.
up. I thought Jeff in the chat really anticipated one of your suggestions when he said, ask uh, the politicians if they've ever worked a minimum wage job once in their entire life.
Hmm.
That really resonated with me.
Yeah.
Michael, you're first in line.
Hi, thank you. I'm in my rural suit here. I got a T-shirt and and the sports jacket on for us rural folks. One of the things that you pointed out highly with class and the richer you get more control, and it does control everything.
Hmm.
The money in politics is also an issue. So a lot of the things that we want in terms of messaging and stuff are kind of broken because of some people put it in the chat. Citizens United, where money is now free speech, and the
Hmm.
money in politics causes the campaigns to be so high. And it's also created that industry of your campaign staff, your campaigners. So now there's this industry that is based on money that removes the messaging of the candidate to the
Hmm.
messaging of this machine where they're doing their own polling and this is how you get votes, which increases the disconnect. So what would you recommend on how to break this industry kind of cycle in campaigning to get the messages out so we can improve this connection with our voters? Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, I hear you about Citizens United, and I'm not a fan. I do think, though, that there's less of a strong relationship between how much money is spent in an election and which candidate wins than you might think, right? Um, uh, for many of the last elections, Democrats have outspent Republicans in national elections and won some and lost some, right? So that doesn't mean it's not a problem how much influence rich people have and so on. But at least to my eye, if that money were being spent on year-round organizing, actually figuring out how to, having staff whose job was to listen to people in neighborhoods, understand where they're coming from in rural areas, in suburban areas, everywhere, right? And bring those concerns and actually make a two-way connection between regular people and elected leaders. That would be a fine use of millions and millions of dollars a year, to my mind, right? That billions actually in election years. That's not what it gets used on, right? It gets used primarily on consultants, on ads. Those are the kinds of things, and this is a lot of what my 2022 book, Producing Politics, was about. I talked to political professionals, and one of the things I found in that from talking to folks is, they talk a good game about the strategy that they've got, and they believe in it. They're not, they're not trying to trick anybody, but they just have a very limited sense of what is a reasonable thing for campaigns to do and what is not. And it's as much about sort of talking to other people in the campaign world and the political world as it is about talking to regular voters. I described it in the book as sort of they're playing a game with each other, and voters are the ball or the field or whatever it is. And that's how a lot of voters end up, or potential voters and non-voters end up feeling. So I mean, I would love to see a world where the wealthy had less direct influence on politicians, were less needed to support campaigns. But I actually think, if I care more on some level about how those billions are spent, than the fact that they're there.
Thank you for that question, Michael. Melissa.
Hi there. I am Melissa Bird, and I am actually running for Congress in Oregon's 4th Congressional District Democratic primary. I'm a working mom, Native American, live in a partially rural area, but most of the district is rural. I grew up in a really small town in Utah, but I'm okay. No, I'm just kidding. My question for you is one of the things it's a grassroots campaign. I'm not taking corporate money. I'm not taking APAC money. I've been talking about Ruby's Rural New Deal a lot with folks in the rural areas because I think it's a really incredible platform for people to be learning about and understanding. One of the things that we've been experiencing as we have connected now with tens of thousands of voters at this point is that there is this, I think because of all the things you've talked about, this overall distrust of politicians. And I have a 25 year career in social work advocacy. I've always been on the advocacy community organizing side of things. How do we help voters? I mean, I think it's a trust exercise, right? Like once I win, then they're going to know that I'm not BSing them. But how do we really help voters clearly understand? We keep talking about how we want to change in politics. We want new people in politics. We want people who understand us in politics. And then someone like me shows up who fits all of those boxes.
Mhm.
Um, how do we help voters understand that I'm the person that they are describing?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if I have the answer, right? There's lots of pieces of it. I think one piece, and I imagine you're doing this. You're running a grassroots campaign, is actually asking questions and listening to people, right? And you, of course, can't talk to every single person in a congressional district, but your volunteers can, and there's evidence that there's the term deep canvassing, which I feel like is just there's research on it, et cetera, where you actually sort of you listen to people, you ask them questions, you don't just deliver a message. That's a method that helps people actually change their minds. My sort of slight snark is it's we have a name for have a conversation like humans, right? But having a conversation like a human really makes people feel heard. So I
Right.
think that's part of it. And I think the other thing I would say is I didn't this isn't in the presentation, but it's in the report. A lot of people told us they got really hopeful when Obama was elected. They really thought something was going to change, and then they didn't see the changes they hoped for, and they've just sort of given up. So I think being real about the fact that, and there's lots of reasons for that, right? One is the way the federal government is set up and the House of Representatives, right? Like the Senate, all of that. But the other thing that I think a lot of people would appreciate is just like being real about like there hasn't been, you've heard these promises before.
Yeah.
And the only way we actually get the kind of change that we want to keep promising is if we get enough people who want to do this into office, and it's slow, and it's not going to be that if you're in poverty today, we're going to get you out of poverty on, January, whatever, 2027 or 2029, probably. Um, but having concrete ideas about how to do that, and being real about the disappointment a lot of people feel, I think would go some of the way.
Great. That's what I've been doing. So you affirm that. That's awesome. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thanks for your
Melissa.
work too.
Yeah.
Before we go to Murray, there was a in the same vein, a similar question in the chat, but for city people. How
Mhm.
can city people best reach out to folks in rural or working class folks?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge also because one of the things we know is that volunteers, campaign volunteers, people who are highly engaged in politics, they tend to look a lot like me, right? They tend to be highly educated, white, older, more to the left than the median, even Democratic voter, if they're volunteering in a Democratic campaign, at least on many issues. Um, uh, did I say white? Anyway, right? All of those things. And so, when you go, I don't know if other people have had this experience, but I volunteer pretty much every election to go do door knocking. And there is evidence that just having a door knock on average increases the probability that someone will vote. Right. Um, but I'm going and knocking and, I door knocked. I live in West Philadelphia. It's a pretty multiracial area, Philadelphia. I was door knocking maybe 10 blocks from my house, but it was in a 100% Black working class neighborhood. Um, and I got a couple people to maybe go who wouldn't have otherwise gone, but I knocked on this one door, and I'm getting to the answer to this question. But I went to knock on a door, and a man came up behind me, and he said, "Oh, that's Ms. Jones. She's down at the polls. You don't need to go knock on her door. She works the polls every day, right? Or every year." And I was like, why has nobody gotten Ms. Jones to just talk to everybody on her block, right? Um, I don't need to be talking to people on this block. Ms. Jones works the polls every election, and everybody on the block seems to know her. She should be talking to folks, right? So that's not to say if you're not on a block where there's a lot of people who aren't voting, you can't do something useful. But I think a lot of what needs to happen is figuring out how to tap into the community connections that are already there. And again, that will takes a lot of work, takes a lot of time, can't be done in the 3 weeks before election day when most get out the vote efforts happen. But that's the kind of thing I think is more effective. That said, the evidence is if you can volunteer, volunteer. I would also like to see more campaigns, more organizing efforts that try to match people to the places they're door knocking as well as possible, right? So I at least could say I live a few blocks over when I was knocking on those doors. But we so often have, a recent college graduate from New York running a campaign field office in Eastern Washington, and that's just not how it should be.
Murray, what's your question for Daniel?
Okay, a couple of thoughts, quick. And I like your idea of trying to get people to see and understand the impacts of things on them. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that. I don't know if you remember the old sign that used to be on construction sites, like your tax dollars at
Mhm.
work. So, like, there's an example. Another one I read in a book. They did a survey of people saying, are you impacted by government programs? And more people said no than yes, but they didn't real like the GI Bill, farm subsidies, Pell Grants, child credits, things like that. They're not even aware of some of the things that impact them. And then one more quick thing, and I'll put this in the chat. The impact of what's happening to people personally. There's a great new book out that I keep promoting everywhere I go. It's called Burned by Billionaires by Chuck Collins, and it shows graphically how we are all impacted by the amount of money that's going to the very, very, very top, and the rest of us are all getting burned, and we're fighting with each other while these people are taking advantage of all of us, and we're sitting there, and they want this to happen for us. So that's something I think the more we share and the more we make people aware of that, hey, we're looking in the wrong place, not stabbing at each other, but where should we go? And it'll help all of us related to those different things. So that's my comment, and I'll put the book in the chat. Thank you.
Great, great. Yeah, I think that, I think the other thing is people know, a lot of people we spoke with, they're receiving SNAP food benefits, they're receiving uh, TANF welfare benefits, they know they're receiving benefits. They also know they're not enough. There's also research that, when people engage with these sort of means tested programs, it tends to actually make them less likely to vote and be engaged in politics because the experience of being sort of managed and regulated in a lot of our means tested programs just makes people feel like they don't want any part of this system. It's a really awful system. So I think there's what people know, and there's also what the experience is like for the ways for some of the programs people are in. And both of those things are part of it.
Thank you, Murray. There's to his point too. I think Murray, your first point made me think about there's a lot of folks in the chat asking about sort of like sources of information and
Hmm.
misinformation, disinformation.
Hmm.
What role does that play kind of in some of the stuff you're seeing in your research?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't talk about this a lot because it's a sort of complicated answer, right? Because I don't think that the main issue is that people are misinformed or ignorant. However, a lot of people felt like they didn't know enough to cast a vote, right? And so they were actually informed enough to sort of have an opinion about what kind of information they would need. And a lot of people talked about feeling like they just didn't know where to get trustworthy information at all anymore. That they just would like some place that they thought was reliable and unbiased and et cetera, and they didn't know what that would be. So I think that is one piece of it. I also saw in the chat somebody asked about churches. You know, one of the things that's happened over the last number of decades is just fewer people are involved in all kinds of civic organizations, and that used to be a way, right? If you were a church member, if you were a member of the Masons or any of those sorts of organizations. If you were, even in a bowling league, there's a classic book about this called Bowling Alone. There was a good chance that somebody you were connected to knew something about politics and could help you figure it out, right? Or that the actual leaders of those organizations were giving you clues about, or just direct instructions about which candidates were for people like us. And as there's less involvement in those kinds of organizations, there's just less of a, I think of it as sort of the democratic fabric. There's less, not big D party, but small d democracy. There's fewer ways for that information to travel among people, and instead you get like social media and the internet, which puts us in very much in bubbles. We've got deep fakes, we've got all of this. So that the sort of online world, there's an enormous amount of information at our fingertips, and it's really hard to figure out and increasingly difficult to figure out what of it is good information.
Barbara, what's your
Yes,
question?
I was first going to make a comment about misinformation and disinformation. I've created a workshop to give adults tools to decode the news.
Oh, great.
And I'll put my email in the chat. I would be more than happy to share the workshop with anybody that's interested. And they can, as long as they credit me, they can rearrange things to what fits them. My comment is I live in Ithaca, New York, where Cornell University is, point of reference. And
Mhm.
what I have found is the progressives. And for quite a while, I worked on single payer healthcare. I think that we desperately need that in this country, like normal countries have. It's important to cross ethnic, class, and cultural boundaries and form relationships with, say, a leader in a community that's different from yourself, be invited into the community, and using storytelling, doing a lot of listening and having people tell their stories. This could be on any issue, and then you know, coming back to the group and providing information appropriate to that community and giving the community the support that they need. And in this case, I was thinking about rural communities. This was back in 2016. But like I said, the people where I am they don't want to do that. And it's really bothers me a lot. So that's my 10 cents because it's inflation, and maybe it's 15 this week. I don't know. Anyway, Daniel, if you have anything to add or comment,
Yeah.
please do. Thank you as always, Cody. This is a wonderful. I rushed home, so I know I missed a lot, a little, but I wanted to make sure I got to come and be part of.
Thank you for being here, Barbara.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what you said goes to, we think about politics as like individuals making decisions about, based on their values about what they're gonna do on election day, right? And politics really, like, that can't work. That's not how most people actually do politics, right? And if you're not in communities, if you're not connected to people, then you're not, we're not actually having a full democracy. We're just having like opinion polls every few years. And that's not how we actually want to have how we actually want to figure stuff out. So I really appreciate what you said about, making connections across differences and not just staying in your own little part of the social world.
Jeff, you're up.
Oh, great. First, I want to say thank you. You on LinkedIn, I was going to post the link, posted something so good that got to the heart of so many things that we're dealing with. And it just was a beautiful thing to read and just share with people. And I'm going to post it in the chat as well. And it's not about me. I don't care about me. It's about your message is so important to get out. And I actually have a partial solution because when I was looking at reading, imagine if we showed these people the generosity that they actually deserve by simply giving we're going to do some means testing. It's the means testing industrial complex you want to be mad at, not means testing. Means testing is how we help as many people as possible with a fixed pool of funds. I'm not talking about healthcare. If you have a pulse, you should get healthcare. I'm talking about money. And there's a lot of it in the second Gilded Age. Simply direct cash transfer, giving the people who need it money and trusting them to actually know how to lead their own lives is incredibly transformative. They will immediately see that you care because you do. So I'm like, politicians, you can go to rgmi.org, I'll post it, doesn't matter, staygold.us. Politicians, run on this platform. I'm begging you, right? Like, I've given you the tool you need to win, so use it. I don't know why they aren't, but maybe ask that question like really loudly to a lot of politicians. That's all I got, and thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there are other things that can show people that politics matters to them, but absolutely, people who are getting
Healthcare
checks
for
during the
sure. I mean,
yeah,
no
right.
question. I'm working at
Yeah,
economics layer. If you're dead,
yeah.
money doesn't matter. I get it.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I don't, during the pandemic, people got checks. And, a number of people I talked to said, especially the checks that came with, Donald Trump's signature on them, people were like, I know who cared about me. I got a check. It had a name on it. I'm voting for that guy next time. Right. Not a ton of people, but definitely a few. That's something you could absolutely see. Here's a government policy that affects me. Here's, $325 or whatever it was in my bank account. So yeah, that's certainly one thing that we could do.
And I'm not saying it's the full solution
Yeah.
by any means. If there's a button that says fix everything, show me and I'll push it now.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
That was great. Pete, what's on your mind?
Okay. Hi. I guess I have a lot of conflicts with what's going on, but what I don't hear is the forces involved from the corporations themselves. You talk about wealthy people, but I didn't hear anybody mention the impact of corporate lobbyists and what they're doing, and the dynamics between the politics and behind the scenes, not just the billionaires. Of course, they're a key element, but what corporations are doing to prevent the information. Talk about misinformation and et cetera. They are very instrumental in not letting messages get out to average people because it might be too detrimental to their bottom line or their profit line. I think that's key, and there's a lot of lack of understanding in the system. The other side is I've been involved with a group called Swing Left, who is taking a slightly, I don't know if anybody's heard about them. It's a national organization doing canvassing, but their canvassing approach is going to every door. They don't go, talking to Democrats. They go talking to every door and profiling what those people are saying in detail without bias. And it's not asking them, are they Republicans or et cetera. So it's really open-ended questions what do you think is going on? Do you think you'll vote? Where's your spectrum politically? And then, for instance, checking back with them 2 or 3 months later to see where they're at, because changes occur, events occur, and people's minds are changed. But that all that information is collected, put into an AI tool, and then provided to the campaigns and to the party people to give back to the candidates so they can speak and go back to those people. So there's the voter has been particularly pissed at the fact that nobody listens to them, and that's why they don't talk to us, and they could care less about what we're talking about, which is the whole disconnect. But start talking back to these people. Don't ask them to give money. Tell them what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and go back to them and have those conversations with non value laden political positions. I mean, I don't have much more to say, but let's see what happens with Mamdani's campaign in New York, and where he's going to take his political world. That might have some effect. And when Trump crumbles and goes away, maybe that will give an opportunity to make some radical turnaround. There's obviously big adjustments. I said in the chat, the Democratic Party is in bed with corporate donors. And that's why a lot of what voters and working class people should hear, they don't hear, because those donors don't want those communications out in the public forum. Yeah, I'm just totally frustrated with where we're at. Yeah, I grew up as a progressive in New York City, and I saw Trump's activities. Part of why we're here is because most of the country doesn't know Trump from his world that he created for the last 50 years, screwing every contract that he had. I can go on and on.
A lot of great points there, Pete. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you raised a lot of great points, and the recommendations in this report don't solve all issues. I'm not talking directly about the role of corporate interests or the money in politics, but I think absolutely some of what you said is what we heard from people, that they have either directly know or just sort of have a sense that a lot of what's happening, a lot of decisions that get made are about wealthy people in back rooms rather than democracy as we believe it ought to work. I will say that that's not the only part of what happens in politics, right? There's all these efforts to shift it in other directions, but it is a big part of what happens, and that really is a problem. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pete. John, what's your question?
Am I unmuted?
No, yeah, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay. I'd like to turn the train around. I was a union rep, spent half my working life talking to working people. Well, I don't have much hair left. What I have trouble with is talking to the progressives, who think that they are the solutions to the upcoming elections, and if we just get all the progressives out, we'll win the election. I'm of the opinion that the folks that we've been talking about here are, I need an elevator speech. I need like a minute and a half that will open the door, that I can get my foot in the door. I can throw all the facts and figures around, but if I can't get in, I'm useless. Got one?
I don't think there's one elevator speech for every person that I talk to. I think what you're getting at, though, that my parents were both union reps also. And I think one thing you're getting at, though, is that there's a segment of really politically engaged people, which is probably some of the people here, not all of them, who think about politics in a particular way. And I don't know if progressives is the right term. I sometimes half jokingly say liberal elite. But there's a set of people who think they know the right solutions, and a lot of the things we advocate for would genuinely be good for folks, right? But there's often this way of talking about politics, way of thinking about politics that just doesn't mesh with where a lot of people are at. Right. And so, people who are highly educated tend to be highly ideological, tend to have, sets of beliefs about politics that all line up, ducks in a row with positions down the line. Those are all positions I tend to agree with, but that's not the way most people think about politics. Most people have, pretty mixed ideas about a lot of things. So I'm a trans man. There was a poll out recently that showed, a lot of people are anti-trans on lots of issues, but it also showed the majority of people who were asked a question about trans issues said we should make sure trans people aren't discriminated against, right? So you get these, if you poll people, you get this really sort of, people are actually pretty muddy and complicated about how they understand a lot of issues. So if you start from you have to have the right view on every single thing, then you're not going to win very many people, right? If you start from I want to listen, I want to understand where you are, where you're at, I want to understand what you care about, that's a lot more likely to move people, but it has to be real. Right. And again, that's hard to do at a large scale. A person or two ago was talking about one effort to do that. But I do think at the end of the day, having mechanisms that bring political leaders into contact with regular people is the only way you make politics real, the only way you make politics something that actually is representing people.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's great. If I can just add my 2 cents on an elevator pitch, the best elevator pitch is whatever can communicate that you actually care about them as a human being rather than just a vote.
Mhm.
Robert, what's your question?
Well, I was raised in Chicago in abject poverty, and I guess this says on you, I was raised in abject poverty. And one thing I recognized in the city of Chicago is back in the 30s, of course, Al Capone used to steal like everything, but he gave a lot to the poor people. And when he did so, everybody knew it came from Al Capone. And so that's something we don't do. We go ahead and pass legislation that helps the poor people, and we don't tell them where it came from. Donald Trump sits and puts his name on something that was done by somebody else, and he takes credit for it, and other politicians as well. But we don't then give the voice to the people. But what made it work in Chicago was that, like a local alderman would go down and come up with the money and would go to a local playground, for example, and have a Halloween festival, and it was free for all the poor kids. Everybody knew that he threw this annual event and spent a lot of money for them so they could get candy and apples and other things and have pie eating contests. And it was a great way to pull the community together. And they knew who the politician was. And they got the votes that way. And that's how the machine ran. In the rural areas, we don't do that. The money doesn't go out here. Well, there's not enough votes out here, and not enough money is spent in the rural area, and the people out here stay poor. And especially what happens in rural areas is the kids leave, they go to college and they get their jobs in their city. They don't come back to the rural area. So rural areas have old people living in it. And the old people are not they're all in poverty. Our county out here in Virginia has 48% poverty out here.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody does anything. The local it's a 70% one party, the Republicans over Democrats out here. So you can't really bring any programs in hardly, especially if the state government isn't run. So I'm with you. We need to be able to get that. I propose that somebody out here, and maybe around the nation, consider it and work it out, is get out and get a party behind it and have a poor citizens forum. And I mean, call it poor citizens. Let them self-identify that, hey, I'm poor, I want to go to this thing, and have all kinds of nice little treats, have little contests for the kids, do things, for the community, make it a major community event in the rural area. And you'll be surprised how much you'll turn around the vote, and the people will feel like they are part of it. Register them to vote at all these events. And then you follow through on all of those that you register and get them out to vote whenever it comes voting day. I think that would be a great way to turn things around, and that's what we're doing out here. And so I recommend this same idea to a lot of other people in rural areas. and just don't make it illegal and give away $1 million like Elon Musk did up there in Pennsylvania, and other places. That's buying the vote, which is what they used to do in Chicago, of course.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you for that, Robert. Really bringing the Chicago realpolitik to the conversation.
Yeah. And I think that's, I talk about this also in my last book a bit that, there's lots of things that were not good about the way machine politics worked in this country, right? There was all kinds of, if you didn't vote the right way, your garbage wouldn't get picked up, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing you can say for a political machine is the job of a political staffer was to know and understand a particular community that they were assigned to. And that is just not something that we have in the same way anymore. And we also do have often local politicians who will, in my neighborhood, our city council person, our state rep will do turkey giveaways, et cetera, et cetera. But then when the national party comes out to run a campaign, they don't talk to the local officials or the local electeds nearly as much as I think they could, or the local organizations. So there's also this sort of disconnect between what's happening at the national level and and the people in communities who actually do have some of those connections, who do have some of the faith of some of the people that they're working with. So yeah, I think a lot of what you said, I think is just right. Thank you.
Dr. Pam, can you jump in here?
Yes. So I am in Spokane, Washington. And first to Jeff, anyone who has no pulse needs healthcare access right away. Hopefully they're not worried about that bill.
100% agree.
Yeah.
But universal becomes problematic when you talk about money, a big liability, but for health, yeah.
So my question is, so in Spokane, we've been in the paper, not for our great policies as Democrats, but because we can't get along and we fire chair people or they step down. We can't pass an agenda because there's this infighting. Mm-hmm. They're great people. And yet we're infighting because we're so frustrated with what's going on that we feel like we can't combat what's going on with MEGA and people are hurting. How do you unify a message when you have so many people that are just so frustrated and feel like they need to be activists, but they can't unify to get the message out?
Yeah, that's tricky. And I've seen, a lot of organizations that I'm connected with in various ways over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years fall apart or, get riven by infighting in various ways. And I don't know that I know if I knew the solution, I would tell you. But I think part of it is, or at least in places that I've seen, it's that people are wedded. Some of what's going on is people are wedded to a particular ideology or a particular way of doing things or a particular set of values rather than wedded to a community or helping people directly in some way. And if we're all trying to feed our neighbors, it doesn't matter so much to me what your opinion is on trans issues or whether we need universal basic income versus means tested programs versus whatever, or whether, a whole host of issues, right? And so I think that is part of the problem is that, in a lot of corners of the social world, not all of it at all, but a lot of corners of the sort of activist, frustrated, progressive world, we are more committed to ideas maybe than action sometimes. And that can really get in the way of action. So how you get people to move off of that if they're on it, right, is another question. And often both sides feel like they're the one being, victimized by the other, and it gets very complicated. But I do think there's something about if you're actually trying to let's feed people in this neighborhood, let's run a voter registration drive, let's do something rather than let's just express our opinions, you can get a lot further.
Thank you. Be a great sociology experiment. Whoa.
Yeah. Oops, you're muted, Cody, if you're trying to talk.
I am trying to talk. Thank you, Pam. Daniel, are you good to go to 2:15?
Sure.
Get these last three hands here. Zach, what do you got for us?
Hey there, thanks so much for this talk. I just wanted to hop in. You talked a little bit about, and others have mentioned, um, the importance of the importance of the information people are receiving, and in your research, the questions you asked or the questions that were recorded. Did your research report collect any data about the types of news diets or information diets people had, or were there responses from folks that you talked to that indicated or gave you an idea about how people are perceiving the world, what tools people are using to perceive the world around them, especially when it relates to things you mentioned like addressing poverty, addressing just general welfare?
Yeah, we did. So we asked most people to talk a little bit about where, were they following the news? Where did they get their news? I couldn't give you, and it's a qualitative study, so it's not representative in a systematic way. We couldn't say, X% of people get their news Y way. There's other studies that do that. What I will say is that, people were on social media, were following things that way, especially the younger people. People were, we had some really religious Fox News listeners. We had some MSNBC. We had some, I just sort of scan the headlines, or I try to look at the news every way. So I had a lot of different things. But I think what I will say that came up a number of times and that I think is really important, goes back to a point I was making earlier and goes back to sort of how people actually work, right? We think about this in terms of like, how do we get the right news out to all those atomized individuals all across the country who need to know what they need to know. And I would love it if we had more local news, if we had a better way to do that. But a lot of people get their political opinions from the people around them in their communities, from their neighbors, from their families, from their friends, and from the groups they're part of, if they're part of groups. And that's something that is not tweakable by having exactly the right algorithm, or having the right having a better information source more broadly. So I think, and the media stuff is not my area of expertise, although there are people with good studies on that. So yes, I don't have a ton to say there, except well, I will say one. I'll share one quick story because it just sort of illustrates this point. There was a guy we interviewed who lived in Chester, the city I talked about earlier, who really, we interviewed him not, sometime in summer of 21 or 22, and he told us he'd voted for Biden in 2020. But he told us he voted for Biden because he heard he heard Trump was a white supremacist, and he was a white guy, but he was like, I'm not voting for a white supremacist. That's not okay with me. But then his buddy had told him, actually, that's not true. That's just a rumor. And Trump actually would have been better for for the business we work for. And he just was like, I just don't know. I don't know what to believe. I don't know how to make up my mind between these two different friends who told me different things. And I don't think that any news program by itself was going to do that. So that's where a lot of people are.
Thank you, Zach. Robert. You're still muted, Robert.
Also muted.
Robert, we'd love to hear you, but you're still muted. Robert, the question looks really good, but we can't hear you. You're still muted.
Which Robert you trying to get? Robert's iPad?
Hey,
there you go.
Robert's iPad is.
Yeah.
Is that better?
That's better. We got you
All
now.
right.
Okay, you hear me now. Put your thumb up. Yeah. All right, great. So one thing that I've found that brings everybody together and would answer a lot of these questions, a lot of these problems, like how do you get your news? What if we had a public election forum that didn't cost any of the candidates money, and it was a single source for all of the election information? Does that sound good?
Yeah, I mean, we have public television and public radio. People don't read it as unbiased, but I think, there are a lot of.
No, if you had one actual source. So I put together a plan called No Money Elections, as in zero, nomoneyelections.org. and it spells out how we could do this. And people I've talked to, it doesn't matter what their income level or what side of the political spectrum they come from. Everybody says, now that's something I could get behind. So I would urge everybody here to take a look at that. It's called nomoneyelections.org. It spells out exactly how it could be accomplished, and it's not. It's a nationwide thing. Everybody I've talked to, like I say, makes no difference what side, where they come from, and it's a very comprehensive plan. It doesn't have to be exactly like it's meant as a feasibility study to show that it could actually be done. So, how many people here would think would be a good thing to get money out of our elections?
And how about 6-week elections? That's it, not 2 years. That's the other problem.
That's the main thing, exactly.
We need to do things like normal countries do, but we don't seem to be geared that way.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. I love a good workshop. Yeah. Howard, you are the grand finale.
Actually, let's get together on that. And I could certainly do that. I could certainly present for you, because it doesn't make any difference whether you're rural or urban. Everybody loves it.
Well, I think that is certainly the ideal. Howard, I'm not sure which movie star you look like. You're reminding me of somebody, but you are the grand finale in this meeting. Take us away.
So I really resonated, Daniel, with what you were saying before about not necessarily how much money goes into campaigns, but how it's used. And I was so turned off by all of the money that Kamala Harris raised and misused, billions, a couple of $1 billion. I have come across a couple of umbrella fundraising organizations. One is called Focus for Democracy. The other is called Walk the Walk. And what they do is they conduct or work with grassroots organizations to conduct randomized controlled trials on different strategies that those groups are using to determine which ones are most effective in engaging people, particularly in working class, low-income communities of color. And so they go through this process of doing research and deciding or determining which organizations to support. And I have put in the chat the URLs for both of those organizations, and I urge people to take a look at them because they do fabulous work.
Great. Yeah, one thing I would also say just to all of these suggestions is I don't think, all of the problems we're facing as a democracy right now, there's not one solution. There's not even probably 10 solutions, right? There's a number of organizations, Ruby being one of them, doing really good work to try to bring people together, to try to connect people back to democracy in different ways, to try to evaluate what we need to do. The one thing I think is we probably need less of is sort of broadcast political ads and billboards and that sort of thing. They work to turn people off. They work to make people scared. They work to shift people's ideas about various issues, but they don't work very well to change people's minds or to bring people into democracy. And in fact, I think in a lot of cases, people I'm talking to, they just tune them out. So lots and lots of things. Suggestions you all made, and suggestions in my report that can bring people back into democracy. And I love the work that groups do that actually use controlled experiments and so on to figure that out. And I think a lot of us could spend less time debating exactly what's the right solution and more time sort of pulling on the one piece that we can pull on. So thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. Really appreciate your presentation. Thank you all for being here. I'd love to mix it up with everybody on all of our monthly topics, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I'm happy to talk to other folks in other forums if people want to reach out to me. Just very Googleable.